Hello students, welcome to the Analyst, dated 23rd of August 2023. Today we'll look at 5 important articles from the Indian Express and the Hindu. The first article will be regarding section 8 of Representation of Peoples Act 1951. Then we'll look at the fragile Himalayan ecosystem. Then we'll take up a case study of Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster. Then we'll take up Bharat NCAP. And then finally we'll look at Unique Identification Authority of India. Now the first article pertains to your GS2 part of syllabus, where we have to look at salient features of RPA Act. So that means both the acts 1950 and 1951. So two acts of Representation of Peoples Act. Now why section 8 is so important? Because section 8 talks about disqualification. And this has been in the news for a long while. Therefore, a question can be expected that what are the grounds for disqualification, etc. Now, this is also important because of criminalization of politics. Now, let's look at Article 102. So, Article 102 lays down the grounds for disqualification of membership. So, clause 1 says that a person shall be disqualified for being chosen. That means you cannot be chosen. That means you cannot fight an election. Or for being. That means even if you are in the office, you cannot hold that office if one of these clauses are justified. That means if you hold any office of profit, if you are of unsound mind, you are undischarged, insolvent, you are not a citizenship, you are not having citizenship, or you have forfeited your citizenship, then you are disqualified under any law. That means any other act, any other special statute that is there, any law is there which disqualifies you. Then clause 2 says that it gives also the 10th schedule, that is your anti-defection. So constitutionally speaking, Article 102 1 clause E empowers the parliament to bring an act about the disqualification, right? So we have the Representation of Peoples Act, and within it section 8 becomes extremely important because it lays down a lot of criteria for disqualification. Then we must look at the RPA Act of 1951. What it does. So key provisions include that how the elections will be conducted and how the by-elections will be conducted. Then what is the administrative machinery that will be helping in conduct of a free and fair election. Then about settling disputes and about curbing corrupt practices and offences which happens during elections. Then we'll also talk about qualification and disqualification. But what concerns us today is Section 8 of Representation of Peoples Act. Now here, clause 1 of Section 8 says that a person convicted of an offence under these acts, which acts? IPC, Protection of Civil Liberties, Civil Rights Act, then UAPA, then Prevention of Corruption Act, then POTA, Prevention of Terrorism Act, etc., right, shall be disqualified. Wherein the convicted person is sentenced to two options: only fine. If you are only fined, then for 6 years. And if imprisonment, then let's say you are imprisoned, you are convicted for let's say 3 years. You are being given punishment for 3 years. So that 3 years plus 6 years. So that is your tenure of disqualification. Then section 8.2 again gives that a person who is convicted of any law which prevents hoarding or profiteering or the Dowry Prohibition Act. So essentially, if you are promoting any social evil or you are involved in any corrupt practice or you are involved in let's say terrorism, drug trade, trafficking, etc. So all those offenses, the multiple offenses that are there. So usually what happens? You tend to be disqualified if you are convicted. Now conviction, what do we mean by conviction? That means the court has decided that you have been found guilty. Right? Now, let's look at section 8.3. Convicted of any offense and sentenced to imprisonment for not less than 2 years. So usually for serious offenses, you get more than 2 years. 2 years or more than 2 years. Now, shall continue to be disqualified for a further period of 6 years since his release. That simply means X plus 6. So whatever is your punishment plus 6 years. Now, section 8.4 became very contentious. Why? Because it provided for convicted lawmakers to retain their seats if they have filed an appeal within 3 months. Now, what do we mean by this? So, let's say I am a member of parliament, right? And then I am found guilty by the court of one of these offenses. And I have been given a 3-year term, right? I have been given a 3-year of jail term. Now what happens? So usually what happens, I have been found guilty. So what I'll do is I'll go to the court for appeal. Now section 8.4 gave us a breather. What kind of breather? That if I go for appeal within 3 months of my conviction, then what will happen? Then I will not be disqualified. Till when? Till my appeal is pending. So that created what? A loophole. That simply means that as a parliamentarian, an MP can commit a crime, right? As a member of parliament, I have committed a crime. Then I was convicted also. And due to this conviction, I was liable to be disqualified. But instead of facing disqualification, what I do is I go for an appeal within 3 months. And if I go for this appeal, what happens? My disqualification is essentially nullified. Till what time? Till a final decision has been taken by the court on my appeal. So, now the moot point lies that if my appeal remains pending for 7 years, what happens? Maybe I can win 2 more elections. Let's say it remains for 14 years. Then what happens? So due to this, what happened? A lot of convicted parliamentarians were able to retain their seats as well as fight elections. Now, this issue was raised in a landmark judgment called Lilly Thomas versus Union of India 2013. And here, the most important ratio was that clause 4 of section 8 was struck down as unconstitutional, right? And we can also quote this case law whenever we are talking about criminalization of politics, etc. Now, this case revolves around convicted lawmakers. That means the court has found you guilty, right? Then this case calls for immediate disqualification. That means what? That means I do not have a 3-month window or a time to file an appeal. And immaterial of whether I am going for an appeal before the higher court or not. So I can go and ask that there are some grounds on which I want a review. I want to appeal the case from the lower courts. So immaterial of what I do if I am convicted, and for more than, if I am facing a jail term of more than 2 years, 2 years or more than 2 years, then what happens? Immediate disqualification. Then there is no automatic stay on conviction if I go for an appeal. So the two processes of me filing an appeal and second, the disqualification triggering, they have been separated. They have been dehyphenated, right? Furthermore, the court also asked the candidates to declare their prior cases, their criminal records before the public. So what it does, what this case law does, what this judgment does. So it essentially is trying to clean up politics to, so this case along with other cases like Lok Prahari are seen as the judicial intervention towards electoral reforms. Right? And what was the ground? What was the morale? So the idea was to uphold constitutional morality, good governance, and public's trust in political system, and to ensure that all of these remain and they improve over the period of time. We must appreciate that Lily Thomas was a landmark judgment. And why this has been in news? Because of conviction, the recent conviction of a parliamentarian, then disqualification, then recently a stay. And due to that stay by the Supreme Court, what has actually happened? So the disqualification stands nullified. So one argument is that the recent judgment of the Supreme Court somehow nullifies the Lily Thomas judgment. Right? Now, let's look at the second article. This pertains to your GS1, Geography. Now, here we are looking at the continuous degradation of a fragile Himalayan ecosystem. Now, what do we mean by ecosystem? So, it's a ecological and it's a system also. By system, what do we mean? It's a complex reality. And also a system has many parts which work in symphony or which are synchronized. Then when we are talking about ecological relationships, we are talking about the relationships between living and non-living things within the larger environment. How do they relate to each other? How do they talk to each other? How do they converge in a system? Now, let's appreciate a few points about the Himalayas. So, first, they are young and then they are fold mountains. By young, that means the rock structure is immature. By fold, that means there is compression. And we know that this is a active plate boundary. Why? Because the Indian plate is subducting below the Eurasian plate. Then we also must appreciate that these are steep slopes. What do we mean by steep slopes? So when we are looking from the perspective of India, so let's say this is the northern plains. So the northern plains average elevation, let's say 100 meters, right? And what is the height of the Himalayas? So the Himadri has an average height of 6,000 meters, and then the Tibetan plateau has an average height of 4,000 meters. So can I say that the slope, that the angle from the northern plains towards the Himalayas is extremely steep? And therefore, if I have a steeper slope, then what happens? If I have a steeper slope towards India, then what happens? So any debris, any water that comes down will have very high energy and which will transform into velocity. So anything which is here at the top, it will have extreme amount of potential energy, and as it comes down, what will happen? This potential energy will be converted into velocity or essentially kinetic energy. So you are young you are fold, that means there is compression. You are around active plate boundary, you have steep slopes, and you also have sedimentary rocks with cracks, and where the binding of the constituents is also weak. And we also saw that the terrain is immature because these are young fold mountains. Then we also are part of a seismic zone, and therefore earthquake will be more frequent. Let's look at some other factors which are present in the Himalayas. So river systems, snow, rain, glaciers. So what do we see? All these constituents, what they will do? So let's say there is a rock and there are some cracks. So what will happen over the period of time? Here, let's say some water will percolate. Here some, let's say, sand is percolating. Here some snow is percolating, right? So what will happen over the period of time? With continuous expansion, contraction, and other elements getting into the cracks. So inherent weaknesses will be built in the material itself. So when we are looking at river systems, we are again looking at water plus debris plus a lot of speed. So continuously water is coming and thrashing the Himalayas, right? All along the boundaries. What about snow? So one time it will freeze the surface, at the other time there will be thawing or melting of the snow, right? During summers. So expansion, contraction, freezing and then heating. So what happens? Your weakness of material comes in. Then rain showers. Now these rain showers can be as good as cloudburst, or they can be having dry spells. So what it will do? It will lead to a lot of weathering. That means degradation in situ. That simply means that rocks will gradually be transformed into your alluvial soil. So the alluvial soil of the northern plains, they are coming from where? They are coming from the Himalayas, right? So this process is through weathering plus transportation. And who is bringing this soil to the northern plains? It is the rivers. So degrading as well as transporting agents both are present, and nature also changes its colors with seasons. Now what about forest cover? We see that some of the Himalayan regions, they are extremely green. Some are extremely barren, and some have been deforested, and some have been used for agriculture. So good examples are terrace, then horticulture. Example, apple orchards. What about deforestation? So the native species being replaced for paper and pulp industry. And why do we want industry? Because we want more resources, more revenues for the state government, and we want more investments. So some incentives to the industry to set up pharmaceutical and paper and pulp industry here, as well as cement factories. Then green and barren. So there are slopes which are rain bearing, plus they are fertile, while there are some rain shadows. Rain shadow area, let's say Spiti, not able to receive due amount of water. So what happens? You have very steep slopes and you have barren mountains, and simultaneously you have all the other factors, right? So when I'm talking about rain shadow, let's say these are two consecutive mountain ranges and the winds are coming from this side. So maybe this slope is more forested. Why? Because of direct sun and cloud cover coming and going for precipitation. But these regions, they can have barren slopes, right? Now, what we are witnessing in the Himalayan ecosystem. So we are looking at a lot of hazards turning into disasters. And what do we mean by a hazard? So it is a risk. But this risk has been amplified by both natural as well as anthropogenic factors. So when we are talking about natural factors, the biggest source of variations is your climate change, and second best is your anthropogenic activities, or you can say the developmental activities that is happening in these regions through the entire Himalayan regions, irrespective of whichever state is there. So what are we seeing? We are seeing more frequent avalanches. We are looking at more freeze and thaw activity. Freeze, that means more snow, and thaw, that means retreating glaciers. Then we recently saw cloud bursts in regions of Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand due to merging of Western Ghat, your western disturbances, as well as your southwest monsoons. Similarly, we saw mud flows, landslides. Why? Because a lot of flow systems were disrupted. So let's say this is the air flow system. This is the direction of air. Let's say this is the direction of water. So what we have done? We have manipulated with water. We have diverted the airflow by building some infrastructure. So we are also modifying the flow systems. So a complex reality comes in front of us, which is a mix of climate change effects as well as the anthropogenic intervention in these regions. Now, what is the way forward? So we must look at the regional approach. That means we have to look at Himalayan region as a whole, and therefore some type of regional governance. So a disaster management council which comprises of all the Himalayan states, so that they can share their best practices as well as they can alert each other and they can learn from each other. Then real-time sensors. Now we are in the generation of artificial intelligence, machine learning, data analytics. So we must look at real-time sensors and using the data of these regions and integrating the data, we can go for 3D mapping and dynamic assessment of these regions. What do we mean by dynamic assessment? So build simulation of these regions along with all the flows, let's say water flow, rain, then we are looking at western disturbance. So all the flows, looking at them together in a dynamic reality through complex modeling and using the data that we are getting from different sources, integrating that data to finally come up with models. Now this will help us to build what? It will help us to build AI based predictive modeling, which will help in finally achieving vulnerability mapping. So different region in a space have different vulnerabilities. And sometimes what happens? Multiple vulnerabilities converge. And this is the critical area where cascading hazards can happen. and we'll see how cascading hazards happen in the Fukushima Daiichi case study. So we have to look at these vulnerability mapping, which is based upon data, and build some dynamic predictive modeling, as well as going for integrated systems of alert. So we have to look at real-time sensors and regional level. Then we must go for eco-sensitive building codes. That means what? That means today we are building any, let's say, structure we are taking up. So we are using what? We are using the same building codes, let's say, which is used in Uttar Pradesh or let's say in Delhi. Now we must look at alternative structures, eco-sensitive structures, let's say bamboo based or wood based, which are, let's say, lightweight and which are suited to the local environment. So eco-sensitive building codes and identification of hazard hotspots. Let's say in a region, this is a hazard hotspot. This is a hazard hotspot. Now what we can do is, let's say we can label these areas as red areas, then green areas. So what will happen? We will tend to avoid the red areas, and we'll try to maintain or rejuvenate such regions, and we will keep tourists away from these regions. Why? Because we want to decrease the impact on humans, right? Because end of the day we only suffer in form of life loss as well as property loss. Then let's say we have built a code where level 1, 2, 3, the way we go for your mapping of earthquakes. So let's say 1 is a no-go area. Let's say 2 is a partially no-go area. So we can allow some activities based upon the risk that is allocated. And let's say 4 is regions where we can build cities. So similarly, we need to, based upon the hazard zonation, based upon vulnerability mapping, based upon data analytics and early warning systems, what we have to do, we have to finally look at what human activities can be done in what regions based upon the real-time predictive modeling. Now let's look at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident. This pertains to your GS3, disaster management. Now, what is the context? Japan is saying that it will release 1 million metric tons of treated radioactive water from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, which was wrecked. Now, we must at this point appreciate what is a hazard and what is a disaster. So, hazard is a risk only. Okay. And a disaster is when the hazard occurs and it affects people, property. So a cataclysmic event which affects people and property. And a hazard, when multiplied with vulnerability, it tells us what will be the final impact of a disaster. So let's say a region is extremely hazardous. That means very high risk. But there are no people. There is no infrastructure. Okay, let's say nearby a volcano. No one is living, no infrastructure is there. So what will happen? So even if there is a disaster, it will have little or no impact on humans, property or life. Right? Now, Fukushima Daiichi. So this is located on the east coast of Japan. And how it was triggered was a sequence of events. So these are called cascading events. One leads to another. So first there was an earthquake. So in 2021 there was a earthquake of magnitude 9. Then this led to, so earthquake led to what? A tsunami. Now due to this what happened? Disruption of what? Power supply. So the conventional power supply was cut off, as well as the backup power supply was disabled. This led to what? This led to damage of the nuclear reactor. And this finally led to a huge disaster, the biggest nuclear disaster of the world, Fukushima Daiichi, in recent times. Now, what happened post this, and why the Japanese government wants to do what it is doing? So it wants to release water, but this water has some tritium. So now more than 12 years have passed. So in this 12 years, around $60 billion has to be invested just to clean up the site, and people have been naturally flushed out. Now what the government wants to do is that they want to flush out this water, but the water has some contaminants called tritium, and tritium has a half-life of 12 years. Now what do we mean by tritium and half-life? So tritium is an isotope of hydrogen. And in 12 to 13 years, what happens? Let's say there is 100 units of tritium in water. So after treatment for 12 years, it will decrease to 50. Then in next 20 years, it will decrease to 25. Then in next 12 years again, it will become 12.5. So now one half-life has occurred. That means 12-13 years have passed. So whatever X amount was there in the water, now it has become X by 2. Now this move is also supported by other international organizations, saying that tritium will be harmless. But there are other proponents. Who say that there is no known threshold. That means this is happening for the first time. And whenever we do not know clearly about the outcome of our action, so we must appreciate precautionary principle. So even after dilution, even after treatment, we do not know what will be the impact. Impact on what? The Pacific Ocean. Now let's take one example. Let's say you have Pacific Ocean and you are undergoing trade. You are also maybe using some water. Then you are also going for fishing. Then you are also going for import, export of these products. Then maybe some of it may be used for agriculture. So maybe coastal regions. So water, once contaminated, can it lead to bioaccumulation and biomagnification? So what are we looking at? It is totally uncertain that the release of water, what will be the clear impact? So there is no threshold. Furthermore, it is extremely difficult to remove tritium from water. So if you already kept it for 12-13 years, why can't we go for another half-life of 12-13 years. And that is why a lot of voices against this. So we can use this case study in all our answers pertaining to, let's say, hazards, disaster, or human induced disasters, or talking about nuclear energy. It was asked in 2018 when it was asked to compare the risk of nuclear energy. Why? Because even if it is clean energy, there are a lot of risks that are associated with it. Now, let's look at Bharat NCAP, and this pertains to your GS3. Now, India has come up with its own NCAP called Bharat NCAP, and this compares to your global NCAP ratings, which are given for car safety. So, NCAP stands for New Car Assessment Program. Now, how it compares to the world is that while it will benchmark to the global best practices, simultaneously it will be 4 times cheaper. Now, what are the benefits? So, the first benefit is that it will be cost effective. Then it will save a lot of time. Why? Because let's say an Indian conglomerate wants to go for R&D and it wants to test a system for safety. Then it will be done in easier time, in lesser time, and in a cost effective manner. Then safety will be mainstreamed. So mainstreaming safety. Then building of ecosystem. So all the companies, all the startups who wish to work in the sector of vehicle safety, they will also benefit from domestic testing. Now, this will be based upon star rating, that is 1 to 5 star, and it is aligned to global benchmarks only. But it will also look at some domestic needs. Let's say the difference between our road alignment and our own ingenious needs of safety, right? Given the type of roads, given the type of cars, given the number of people that are traveling on a vehicle, etc. Now, how it will help? So it will empower consumers, it will help in decision making, then it can also help in boosting exports. Why? Because when we have good safety credentials, so all the automobile, and we must appreciate that the automobile sector is one of the biggest exporters of cars as well as bikes. So this automobile sector, they will also mainstream the safety issue, and therefore it will be more export friendly, and it helps us naturally to be Atmanirbhar. Now let's look at UIDAI, and this pertains to your GS2. Now UIDAI was conceived in 2016 as a statutory body, and it is under the Aadhaar Act of 2016. Before this, it was part of the Planning Commission, the erstwhile name of Niti Aayog. Before it was a statutory body. Now, what is the goal behind creating UIDAI? So essentially to create the entire Aadhaar ecosystem. And why did we require Aadhaar ecosystem? For unique ID. A unique ID number to every resident of India, and simultaneously to remove the duplication of IDs. So there are multiple IDs that we have. So duplication of effort is also there. Then to get rid of fake IDs, while to give every citizen a unique ID. And finally, to use that unique ID to integrate the delivery or provision of goods and services. And that is why when we are looking at Aadhaar, we also talk about terms like the Aadhaar stacks, or we are talking about, let's say, Jam Trinity. So UIDAI is the enabler of the Aadhaar ecosystem, and it works under the MeitY, Ministry of Electronics and IT. Thank you so much. I hope it helped.